In the spring of 146 BC, a Roman soldier climbed over a broken wall and stepped into a street filled with the dead. He was not alone. Around him, thousands of his fellow legionaries were doing the same thing, pouring through gaps in the shattered defenses of a city that had refused, even at the very end, to surrender quietly. The city was Carthage. And what happened next was not a battle. It was an extermination. Street by street, house by house, floor by floor. The Romans fought their way through a metropolis of 700,000 people who had nowhere to run and nothing left to lose. Women threw their children from rooftops rather than let them be taken as slaves. Men who had already been disarmed fought back with their bare hands. The sick dragged themselves out of their beds and threw themselves into the fighting because dying in combat felt better than dying in chains. For 6 days the slaughter continued without pause. When it was finally over, the Roman general Scipio Aemilianus stood on a hill overlooking what remained of one of the greatest cities the ancient world had ever produced, and he wept. Not for the dead. Not for the city burning beneath him. He wept because he understood something in that moment that very few conquerors are honest enough to admit. He understood that what Rome had just done would one day happen to Rome itself. "The day shall come," he reportedly whispered, quoting Homer, "in which our sacred Troy and Priam, and the people over whom spear-bearing Priam rules, shall perish all." Then he turned away, and ordered his engineers to pull down every wall still standing. The city of Carthage, a civilization that had existed for over 700 years, that had once commanded the entire western Mediterranean, that had produced some of the greatest sailors, farmers, artists, traders and generals the ancient world had ever seen, was reduced to rubble and ash in a matter of weeks. But that was only the first part of what Rome did to Carthage. The second part was worse. Because after destroying the city, Rome set about destroying the memory. They gave Carthage's libraries away to local kings. They burned what they could not distribute. They rewrote the history of every war, every treaty, every negotiation, making sure that their version, and only their version, survived. They turned the name Punic into a slur so complete that even today, 2,000 years later, most people who have heard of Carthage think of it as a savage, child-sacrificing, treacherous shadow civilization that deserved exactly what it got. This video is about what Carthage actually was. Not the Roman version. Not the Greek version. Not the version that has been handed down through centuries of hostile propaganda to land in your history textbook as a footnote about Hannibal and some elephants crossing the Alps. The real Carthage. A civilization so extraordinary, so original, so genuinely threatening to Rome's ambitions, that Rome could not simply defeat it. Rome had to erase it. And here is the question that should keep you watching until the very last second of this video. How does a civilization that controlled the sea lanes of the entire Mediterranean, that fielded armies that brought Rome to its knees not once but twice, that built harbors so sophisticated that modern engineers still marvel at them, how does a civilization that powerful simply disappear? The answer is not what you think. Let us go back. Far back. Before Hannibal. Before the Punic Wars. Before Rome was even a city worth worrying about. We need to go back to the beginning. To the people who built Carthage in the first place. To a strip of coastline on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, a narrow sliver of land pressed between mountains and sea, where a group of people who called themselves the Cannae, the people of Canaan, were quietly becoming the most important traders in the ancient world. The Greeks had another name for them. They called them the Phoenicians. And the name stuck. The Phoenicians were not, strictly speaking, a single nation. They were a collection of fiercely independent city-states, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Arvad, strung along what is now the coastline of Lebanon. They spoke the same language, shared the same gods, traded in the same goods, but each city answered to its own king and fought its own battles. What united them was the sea. While the great empires of the ancient world, Assyria, Egypt, Babylon, were empires of land, of river valleys, of agricultural plains that could be marched across and conquered, the Phoenicians had looked out at the vast blue expanse of the Mediterranean and seen something different. They had seen a road. And they had built ships that could travel it. Their merchant vessels, wide, round-hulled, painted in deep earth colors, could carry extraordinary quantities of cedar timber, purple-dyed cloth, carved ivory, blown glass, silver ingots, copper ore and worked gold across waters that terrified their neighbors. The Egyptians, with their flat-bottomed riverboats, could barely survive a Mediterranean swell. The Assyrians, whose military was the most feared on land, had no fleet worth the name. Even the Greeks, in those early centuries, were mostly sailing short hops between islands. The Phoenicians were sailing from one end of the known world to the other. And among all their city-states, one stood out. Tyre. Perched on a small rocky island just off the Lebanese coast, Tyre had solved the problem that plagued every other Phoenician city, the problem of water. By cutting deep cisterns into the island rock, the Tyrians secured their survival. By striking a brilliant alliance with the newly united kingdom of Israel under King Solomon, they secured their prosperity. In exchange for timber and skilled craftsmen, Tyrian shipbuilders, metalworkers and stonemasons who helped construct Solomon's great temple in Jerusalem, Tyre received vast quantities of wheat, olive oil, silver and access to trade routes into the interior of Asia. Tyre grew rich. Tyre grew powerful. Tyre grew confident. And then Tyre looked west, out past Cyprus, past Crete, past Sicily, all the way to the very edge of the known world, and decided that the riches waiting out there were worth the voyage to find them. That decision would eventually produce the greatest city in the western Mediterranean. That decision would produce Carthage. The story of how Carthage came to exist is one of the most dramatic foundation myths of the ancient world, and like all the best foundation myths, it contains just enough truth to make the fiction feel real. The year was somewhere around 814 BC. In Tyre, a king named Mutton had just died, leaving behind 2 children, a son named Pygmalion and a daughter named Elissa. The people of Tyre, nervous about instability, pushed for Pygmalion to take the throne alone. He was crowned. He was young. And he was ruthless. His first act as king was to have his brother-in-law murdered. The victim was Acerbas, high priest of the god Melkart, husband of Elissa, and reportedly the wealthiest private citizen in Tyre. Pygmalion wanted that wealth. He killed the man and took it. Or at least, he thought he took it. What he did not know was that Elissa had already moved the gold. She had heard what was coming. She had packed the most portable of her husband's riches onto ships in the dead of night, weighted decoy bags with sand and gravel so they would feel heavy when her brother's agents searched them, and when Pygmalion's men came aboard looking for treasure, they found only bags that clinked convincingly and a queen who smiled too calmly. By the time Pygmalion realized what had happened, Elissa's fleet was already on the open sea. She sailed first to Cyprus, where the high priest of the goddess Astarte joined her expedition, bringing with him 80 young women selected to serve as temple attendants, and more practically, to become wives for the men in Elissa's fleet so that their new settlement would have a future population. From Cyprus she sailed west, following the trade routes that Tyrian merchants had been navigating for generations, until she reached the coast of North Africa. There, a local Libyan king named Hyarbas gave her an audience. He was willing to sell her land, he said, but only as much as could be covered by a single ox hide. Elissa smiled. She took the hide, and she cut it into strips so thin they were barely wider than a thread. Then she laid those strips end to end in a great circle around the hill that would become the heart of her new city. The Libyans stared. Then they laughed. Then they realized what she had done. The hill was called the Barca. The city built around it was called Carthage in the Phoenician language. In Latin, it would be known as Carthago. In English, Carthage. Now here is the thing about the Elissa story. Most of it was almost certainly invented, not by the Carthaginians themselves, but by Greek writers who shaped it according to every negative stereotype they already had about the Phoenician people. Elissa is cunning and deceptive. She manipulates everyone around her. She uses trickery where an honest person would use direct negotiation. Sound familiar? It should. Because those same qualities, cunning, deception, manipulation, would be plastered over every Carthaginian for the next 7 centuries by Greek and Roman writers who needed a villain. But strip away the propaganda and the kernel of truth that remains is genuinely remarkable. Sometime around the late 9th or early 8th century BC, a group of Tyrian settlers established a colonial outpost on a peninsula on the North African coast in what is now modern Tunisia. That settlement was strategically placed at the exact crossroads of the 2 most important trade routes in the Mediterranean, the east-west route connecting the Levant to Spain, and the north-south route linking North Africa to Italy, Sardinia, and the wider Tyrrhenian world. It was, in other words, the perfect location for a trading city. And it grew with a speed that astonished even those who had founded it. Within a century of its foundation, archaeologists can identify cemeteries ringing the early city that suggest a population of around 30,000 people. Within 2 centuries, Carthage had become a major manufacturer of luxury goods, terracotta figurines, carved ivories, purple-dyed cloth, metalwork of extraordinary quality, that were exported across the entire western Phoenician world. Within 3 centuries, it had begun the expansion of its agricultural hinterland into the fertile valleys and plains of North Africa, gradually reducing its dependence on imported food and building the agricultural base of what would eventually become an empire. But Carthage was never simply a city. From its very beginning, it was something more ambitious than that. It was a network. Across Sardinia, Sicily, the Balearic Islands, the coast of Spain, and the Atlantic shores of Morocco, Carthaginian merchants established trading posts, colonies, and commercial relationships that bound the entire western Mediterranean into a single economic system. Raw materials, silver, copper, iron, tin, flowed in from the mines of Spain and Sardinia. Finished goods flowed back out from the workshops of Carthage and its satellite cities. Ships moved constantly between ports, carrying olive oil, wine, salted fish, purple cloth, glass, amber, and carved ivory. It was the ancient world's version of a global trading empire. And at the center of it all was Carthage, growing richer, more powerful, and more confident with each passing generation. But with wealth came rivals. And with rivals came wars. The first great challenge came not from Rome. Rome was still a minor Italian city at this point, barely worth mentioning, but from the Greek settlers who had colonized the eastern half of Sicily and were now looking hungrily at the western portions that the Phoenicians had long considered their own territory. Sicily would become the arena in which Carthage spent the better part of 3 centuries fighting for its survival. It would also become the place where Carthage made the alliances, the enemies, and the political decisions that would eventually bring it face to face with the one power in the ancient world it could not outlast. Rome was coming. But not yet. First, Carthage had to survive the Greeks. Sicily in the 5th century BC was not a peaceful island. It was a battleground, one of the most contested pieces of land in the ancient world, caught between the ambitions of Carthage to the west and the Greek city-states to the east, with a patchwork of indigenous Sicilian, Elymian, and Sycan peoples caught in between, trying to survive the collision of 2 expanding civilizations. The Greeks had been colonizing Sicily since the 8th century BC, establishing cities of breathtaking beauty and ambition: Syracuse, Acragas, Selinus, Gela, cities with marble temples that rivaled anything in mainland Greece, with populations that grew fat on Sicily's extraordinarily fertile agricultural land. The eastern half of the island was effectively a Greek world, and some of its cities were among the wealthiest in the entire Mediterranean. The Phoenicians had been in western Sicily even longer. Their settlements at Panormus, Solus, and the island city of Motia had been established before the Greeks arrived, and they had built strong alliances with the indigenous Elymian people who shared their corner of the island. For a while, the 2 worlds coexisted. They traded with each other. They intermarried. They worshipped versions of each other's gods. Greek artistic styles influenced Punic craftsmen. Phoenician commercial techniques influenced Greek merchants. On the ground, in the cities and villages where ordinary people actually lived, the supposed civilizational conflict between Greeks and Carthaginians was often invisible. But at the level of politics and power, the tension was always there. And it was only a matter of time before it exploded. The explosion came in 483 BC. A Greek tyrant named Tyrillus had been driven out of the Sicilian city of Himera by the forces of Gelon, the powerful ruler of Syracuse who was aggressively expanding his control over the island. Tyrillus turned to his guest friend, the leader of the most powerful clan in Carthage, a man named Hamilcar of the Maganid family, and asked for help. Hamilcar came. He came with a massive army: Carthaginian citizens, Libyan levies, Spanish mercenaries, Sardinian fighters, Corsican soldiers, assembled from across the length and breadth of the Carthaginian world. He came with warships and supply vessels. He came with the intention of driving Gelon back and restoring Carthaginian influence over an island that was slipping away. He came and he lost everything. The Battle of Himera in 480 BC was a catastrophe of such completeness that it would haunt Carthage for generations. The details are disputed. The Greek sources, written by the victors, are predictably triumphalist, but the outcome is not. The Carthaginian army was obliterated. Hamilcar himself died on the battlefield. According to one version of events, as his troops broke and fled around him, Hamilcar threw himself onto the sacrificial fire where he had been making offerings to the gods, choosing death over the humiliation of capture. The survivors who staggered back to North Africa brought news of a defeat so total that Carthage locked itself behind its walls and waited for Gelon's army to appear on the horizon. It never came. Gelon, Facing his own domestic pressures and perhaps recognizing that destroying Carthage entirely would upset the delicate balance of power in the western Mediterranean, accepted a substantial cash payment and a peace treaty instead. Carthage survived. But the shock of Himera forced a fundamental rethinking of everything: its military strategy, its political institutions, its relationship with its own citizen population, and its understanding of what it meant to fight a war far from home. In the decades that followed, Carthage reinvented itself. The old system in which powerful individual families like the Magonids effectively ran the state as their private enterprise was gradually replaced by a more complex constitutional structure. New political bodies were created: a council of elders, a tribunal of judges, a popular assembly, that distributed power more broadly among the Carthaginian elite. Aristotle, who had read extensively about Carthaginian governance, would later describe its constitution as one of the finest in the ancient world, more stable than many Greek city-states, more balanced than the monarchies of the Near East. But political reform was not enough. Carthage also needed to reckon with what had gone wrong militarily. The answer was the army. Carthage, unlike Rome, had never built its military around citizen soldiers. It relied on mercenaries, professionals hired from across its trading empire, fighters from North Africa, Spain, the Balearic Islands, Gaul and Greece, paid in silver and loyal to whoever paid them. That system had advantages. A mercenary army could be assembled quickly, dismissed when not needed, and replaced with fresh troops when casualties mounted. But it also had a fundamental weakness. Mercenaries fought for money. Not for Carthage. Not for its gods. Not for its children. For money. And when the money ran out, or when the cause looked lost, mercenaries had a habit of walking away. This was a lesson Carthage would have to learn again and again. And eventually, it would be a lesson that nearly killed the city entirely. But that reckoning was still in the future. For now, Carthage recovered from Himera with a resilience that surprised its enemies. Trade continued. The agricultural territories of North Africa were expanded. New settlements were established in Sardinia. The silver mines of Spain continued to pour wealth into Carthaginian coffers. And then, nearly 70 years after Himera, Carthage returned to Sicily. This time the Magonid leader was Hannibal, grandson of the Hamilcar who had died at Himera, a man who had spent his entire life waiting for the chance to avenge that defeat. In 409 BC he landed in Sicily with a massive force and marched directly to Selinus, a Greek city that had been pressuring Carthage's Sicilian allies. The citizens of Selinus fought back with everything they had. It was not enough. Selinus fell in 9 days. And then Hannibal turned towards Himera, the city where his grandfather had died, and the people of that city understood with terrible clarity what was coming. The fall of Himera was not just a military victory. It was personal. When the city's walls finally gave way and Hannibal's troops poured through the breach, the Carthaginian general did something that went beyond the normal brutality of ancient warfare. He rounded up 3,000 prisoners, soldiers, citizens, men who had surrendered believing that surrender meant survival, and he marched them to the exact spot where his grandfather Hamilcar was said to have fallen. And there, in full view of his army, he had them killed. Every single one. Not as a military necessity. Not as a strategic calculation. As a memorial. As an offering. As the completion of something that had begun 70 years earlier when a young Magonid general threw himself into a sacrificial fire rather than face defeat. Generations of vengeance, discharged in an afternoon. The Greeks were horrified. Their historians recorded the slaughter in terms of outrage and disgust, painting Hannibal as the embodiment of Carthaginian cruelty. And that image, of Carthaginians as a people uniquely addicted to cruelty and bloodshed, became one of the foundational stereotypes of ancient literature. But here is what those same historians did not mention. In that same period, Greek generals were doing things on the battlefields of Sicily that were every bit as brutal as anything the Carthaginians did. Cities sacked. Populations enslaved. Prisoners executed. Temples looted. The difference was not in the actions themselves, but in who was writing the history. The Greeks wrote their own history. Carthage, as we will see, eventually lost the right to write its own. The wars between Carthage and the Greek cities of Sicily continued for the better part of a century after Himera's fall, a grinding, inconclusive cycle of invasion and counter-invasion, siege and counter-siege, plague and betrayal and shifting alliances. Cities changed hands multiple times. Populations were massacred or enslaved or ransomed. The landscape of Sicily was scarred by decades of violence. Neither side could land the decisive blow that would end it. And then, in the early 4th century BC, a new figure emerged from the chaos of Sicilian politics who would push Carthage closer to the edge of destruction than anything since Himera. His name was Dionysius. He was a young man of humble birth and spectacular ambition who clawed his way to autocratic power in Syracuse through a combination of populist politics, military genius, and absolute ruthlessness. And once he had secured his position at home, he turned the full force of his attention on the Carthaginians. In 397 BC, Dionysius launched the most aggressive assault on Carthaginian power in Sicily that anyone had yet attempted. He expelled the Punic populations from Greek cities across the island. He marched on Motia, the ancient Phoenician island city off the western coast, and put it under siege. Motia fought back. The defenders of the city, knowing what defeat meant, made the Romans, or in this case the Syracusans, pay for every meter. When Dionysius built a giant causeway across the water to bring his siege engines up to the walls, the Motians responded by building towers on their own rooftops so they could fight from above. When the walls were finally breached, they constructed barricades across every street and hurled missiles from their windows. Men, women, old people, everyone who could lift something heavy and throw it downward did so. It was not enough. Motia fell. Its population was sold into slavery. The city was never rebuilt. But Dionysius' triumph was short-lived. Carthage struck back with a massive counteroffensive that swept him back across the island, recaptured most of what he had taken, and came within a few disastrous weeks of capturing Syracuse itself. Only a catastrophic outbreak of disease in the Carthaginian camp, killing soldiers so fast they could not be buried, saved Dionysius from destruction. The cycle repeated. Carthage advanced. Greece pushed back. Neither side prevailed. What emerged from these decades of conflict was something unexpected. Despite the blood, despite the propaganda, despite the genuine hatred that existed between Carthaginian and Greek military commanders, the populations of Sicily continued to live alongside each other, trade with each other, worship versions of each other's gods, and influence each other's art. Greek artistic styles kept appearing in Punic workshops. Punic religious practices kept influencing Greek sanctuaries. The famous statue found at Motia, a young man carved in Greek sculptural style but dressed in the ritual garments of a Punic priest, stands as perhaps the most striking physical evidence of a world that the propaganda of both sides tried to pretend did not exist. A world where Carthaginian and Greek were not simply enemies but neighbors. If you are finding this story as extraordinary as I am, do me a favor right now, hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. We cover the stories history leaves out. The ones that change everything you thought you knew. And there is a great deal more of this one still to come. By the mid-4th century BC, exhaustion on both sides had produced a kind of grudging equilibrium. Carthage controlled the western half of Sicily. Syracuse controlled the east. Neither was strong enough to destroy the other. Neither was willing to admit it. Into this deadlock came news that shook the entire Mediterranean world. A young Macedonian king named Alexander had launched a campaign of conquest so swift and so total that within 12 years he had absorbed the entire Persian Empire, pushed his armies to the borders of India, and transformed the political landscape of the known world beyond recognition. Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BC at the age of 32. But the world he left behind was fundamentally changed. And from the ruins of his empire came a new generation of warrior kings, men who modeled themselves on his image, fought in his shadow, and competed for the pieces of the world he had conquered. One of those men would eventually turn his ambitions toward Carthage. His name was Agathocles of Syracuse. And he would do something that no Greek general had ever dared to attempt. He would take the war to Africa. In 310 BC, Carthage believed it had won. The Syracusan army was bottled up behind the walls of its own city. A powerful Carthaginian force under the general Hamilcar had surrounded Syracuse by land, and a Carthaginian fleet controlled the harbor. The city was going nowhere. It was only a matter of time before starvation, disease, or despair forced its surrender. Agathocles looked at his situation with cold, clear eyes. He had no relief army coming. He had no ally capable of breaking the Carthaginian stranglehold. He had no diplomatic option worth pursuing. Every conventional response to his predicament ended in the same place: defeat, and after defeat, slavery or death for himself and everyone who had followed him. So Agathocles did something that nobody, Not his own generals, not his terrified citizens, not the Carthaginian commanders sitting comfortably in their siege lines, could possibly have predicted. He decided to attack Carthage itself. Not to raid it. Not to threaten it. To actually cross the Mediterranean with an army, land on North African soil, and carry the war to the city that had spent years carrying it to him. It was an act of such staggering audacity that even his own officers thought he had lost his mind. He assembled a fleet of 60 ships and a modest force of around 13,500 men, a fraction of what Carthage could field. He arranged for his remaining forces in Syracuse to hold the city as long as possible. He gave a speech to his assembled troops that was either the most inspiring thing they had ever heard or the most terrifying, depending on how closely you were listening to the odds. And then he burned his own ships. Standing on the beach of North Africa, with the flames rising behind him and the smoke drifting out over the water, Agathocles turned to his army and delivered what Diodorus would record as one of the most remarkable speeches of the ancient world. "Fortune," he told them, "has locked you into a battlefield from which there is no escape. Either you conquer or you die. There is no third option. And since you cannot flee, you may as well fight as men who have decided to win." The army, to its credit, did not break and run. They marched on Carthage. What followed was 6 years of some of the most extraordinary warfare the ancient world had ever seen, fought simultaneously in Sicily, where the Carthaginian army was now being forced to reckon with Syracuse's unexpected defiance, and in North Africa, where Agathocles was cutting a swath through Carthaginian territory with a confidence that bewildered everyone who witnessed it. The Carthaginians panicked. Genuinely panicked. They had never been attacked on their own soil before. The idea that the war could come to them, that instead of sending armies across the sea to fight on somebody else's territory, they might have to defend their own fields, their own farms, their own families, was something for which they had simply no mental preparation. In their desperation, according to Diodorus, they made offerings to their gods on a scale that had not been seen for generations. 200 children from the city's most distinguished families were reportedly sacrificed to appease Baal-Hamon and Tanit. 300 more citizens, according to the same source, volunteered themselves for the same fate. These accounts have been debated endlessly by historians. The Greeks who wrote them were not neutral observers. They had every reason to exaggerate Carthaginian religious practices in the most shocking terms possible. But the archaeology tells its own story. The Tophet, the sacred enclosure where votive offerings were made to the gods, shows intensified use during exactly this period, with urns containing the burned remains of young children appearing in larger numbers than at almost any other time in the city's history. Whatever the full truth of it, Carthage was terrified. And terrified people do desperate things. Agathocles, meanwhile, was doing what he did best, being completely unpredictable. He won battles he should have lost. He formed alliances with Libyan tribes that had long resented Carthaginian taxation. He captured town after town across the Cap Bon Peninsula, the most fertile agricultural region in Carthaginian North Africa, cutting off the food supply to the very city he was trying to bring to its knees. For a brief, extraordinary moment, it genuinely looked as if Carthage might fall. It did not fall. What saved it in the end was not military genius. The Carthaginian commanders in North Africa were, frankly, mediocre at best. What saved it was the city's extraordinary resilience, the financial resources that allowed it to keep hiring fresh troops even after catastrophic losses, and the crucial fact that Agathocles was simultaneously losing the war back home in Sicily. When his son Archagathus, left in command of the African expedition while his father rushed back to deal with the crisis in Syracuse, divided his forces exactly as the Carthaginians hoped he would, the result was predictable. The divided Syracusan forces were picked apart. Agathocles rushed back to Africa to try to retrieve the situation, realized it was hopeless, and in an act of abandonment so complete that it shocked even his enemies, slipped away in the night and left his army behind. His army, betrayed and leaderless, surrendered to the Carthaginians. The terms the Carthaginians offered the captured soldiers were, strikingly, generous. Many were offered places in the Carthaginian army. Others were resettled in Punic cities. Only those who refused to cooperate were punished. It was not the behavior of a civilization defined by cruelty. Agathocles eventually negotiated a peace that restored the old territorial status quo and required Carthage to pay him a large sum in gold and grain. He went home and declared victory. Carthage went home and counted its dead. Neither side had destroyed the other. But the crisis had revealed something important about Carthage, something that its enemies were taking careful note of. For all its wealth, for all its trading networks, for all the sophistication of its political institutions, Carthage had a structural weakness at its very core. It could not produce enough great generals when it needed them most. That weakness would not matter for much longer. Because Rome was watching. And Rome was learning. By the early 3rd century BC, Rome had done something that nobody in the Mediterranean world had quite managed to do before. It had conquered Italy. Not just the city of Rome and its immediate surroundings. Not just Latium, the small region of central Italy where the city had first grown to prominence. All of it. The whole peninsula from the Alps in the north to the toe of the boot in the south. The Samnites, who had fought Rome in 3 brutal wars across the central Apennines. The Etruscans, who had once been the dominant culture of northern Italy. The Greek cities of Magna Graecia in the south, Tarentum, Croton, Locri, cities that had once looked down on Rome as a provincial backwater. All of them brought under Roman control. And what made Rome's conquests different from every other empire that had preceded it was not just the military victories. It was what happened after the victories. Rome did not simply occupy conquered territory and extract tribute. It absorbed people. It extended legal rights. It built roads that connected every corner of the peninsula to the capital. It enrolled defeated populations into its military system, turning yesterday's enemies into tomorrow's soldiers. Every time Rome conquered a new people, it grew stronger. Not just richer, stronger. Because it kept adding human beings to its army. Carthage, watching from across the Mediterranean, understood that something unprecedented was happening on the Italian peninsula. The Carthaginian Council of Elders had been careful to maintain diplomatic relations with Rome, signing treaties in 509 BC, 348 BC and again in the aftermath of the war against Pyrrhus. These treaties were not expressions of warmth. They were expressions of mutual caution, 2 powers carefully defining the boundaries of their respective spheres of influence and hoping they would never have to test those boundaries in open warfare. Those hopes were about to be destroyed by a group of disgruntled mercenaries and a city on the northeastern tip of Sicily called Messana. The Mamertines, the name meant followers of Mamers, the Italian god of war, were Campanian mercenaries who had originally been hired by Agathocles of Syracuse. When Agathocles died, they found themselves without an employer and without prospects. Their solution was characteristically direct. They marched into Messana, massacred its male population, seized its women and property, and declared themselves the new rulers of the city. For a while, this arrangement worked tolerably well for the Mamertines, if not for anyone else. But by the mid-260s BC, they found themselves under serious pressure from Syracuse, now resurgent under an energetic new leader named Hiero. Facing the real possibility of being driven out of Messana entirely, the Mamertines did what desperate people always do. They appealed for outside help. They appealed to Carthage. And they appealed to Rome. The Carthaginians, ever alert to opportunities to extend their influence in Sicily, sent a garrison to Messana almost immediately. For Rome, the decision was far more agonizing. Helping the Mamertines meant crossing the sea, something Rome had almost never done before. It meant potentially provoking Carthage. And it meant coming to the aid of people who had seized a city through massacre, which made the whole enterprise smell of hypocrisy. The Roman Senate deadlocked. The consuls, anxious for military glory, pushed for intervention. Conservative senators pointed out the obvious moral problem. The debate went around in circles until eventually the consuls bypassed the Senate entirely and put the question directly to the popular assembly, which, promised a share of the war booty, voted enthusiastically for intervention. Rome crossed the Strait of Messina. And just like that, the 2 greatest powers in the western Mediterranean were at war. The First Punic War lasted 23 years. 23 years of almost uninterrupted fighting across the length of Sicily and across the surface of the Mediterranean Sea. 23 years that would transform both powers in ways that neither had anticipated when the first Roman troops crossed into Sicily. For Rome, the most dramatic transformation was naval. When the war began, Rome barely had a fleet. It had no tradition of naval warfare, no experienced admirals, no shipbuilding infrastructure worth speaking of. When Roman ambassadors were asked by Carthaginian officials whether Rome intended to fight a war at sea, the honest answer would have been that Rome did not even fully understand what fighting a war at sea meant. Carthage, by contrast, had ruled the Mediterranean for centuries. Its sailors were the most experienced in the world. Its warships, sleek, fast quinquiremes crewed by professionals who had spent their entire lives on the water, were objects of technological sophistication that the Romans could barely comprehend, let alone replicate. So Rome did what Rome always did when it encountered a superior enemy. It studied. It copied. It improved. When a Carthaginian warship ran aground at the start of the war and fell into Roman hands, Roman engineers took it apart plank by plank and used it as the blueprint for an entire fleet. The fleet was built in 60 days, a construction achievement that left the ancient world speechless. The crews trained on rowing benches set up on dry land, learning the mechanics of naval warfare before they had ever touched the water. And then Rome introduced a device that would change naval warfare entirely. They called it the corvus, the crow. It was a boarding bridge, a heavy spiked ramp mounted on a rotating pole at the prow of each Roman ship. When an enemy vessel came close enough, the corvus was dropped onto its deck, the spike drove through the timber and locked the two ships together, and then Roman soldiers, the best heavy infantry in the world, poured across the bridge and turned a naval battle into a land battle. In their first major naval engagement at Mylae in 260 BC, the Romans sank or captured 50 Carthaginian ships. The greatest naval power in the ancient world had just been outthought by a landlocked city that had learned to sail in 60 days. Carthage was stunned. But the war was far from over. The First Punic War ended in 241 BC with Carthage defeated, exhausted and humiliated. Sicily was gone. The island that Carthage had fought over for more than 2 centuries, that had been the centerpiece of its western Mediterranean strategy, was now a Roman province. Sardinia and Corsica followed shortly afterward, seized by Rome in an act of such transparent opportunism that even the pro-Roman historian Polybius described it as contrary to all justice. And then, to compound the disaster, the mercenaries who had fought the war for Carthage, unpaid, angry and dangerous, rose in revolt. For 3 years, from 241 to 238 BC, Carthage fought for its very survival against an army made up largely of its own former soldiers. The war was savage beyond description. Prisoners were tortured to death. Entire armies were annihilated. Cities that supported the rebels were razed. The conflict left Carthage financially devastated, politically traumatized and militarily weakened at exactly the moment when it most needed strength. From this catastrophe emerged a man who would reshape everything. His name was Hamilcar Barca. Hamilcar had commanded the Carthaginian forces in Sicily during the final years of the First Punic War, where his lightning raids on Roman-held territory had earned him a reputation for speed, audacity, and an almost theatrical sense of military theater. He had emerged from the war with his reputation intact, partly because he had the political sense to distance himself from the surrender, partly because his troops genuinely adored him, and partly because he was simply the most gifted military commander Carthage had produced in a generation. After crushing the mercenary revolt with a combination of tactical brilliance and merciless brutality, Hamilcar turned his eyes to Spain. Spain was where Carthage's future lay. Everyone with any strategic vision understood that. The mines of the Sierra Morena Mountains contained silver deposits of almost incomprehensible richness. The indigenous tribes of the peninsula were fierce, numerous, and potentially recruitable. The land itself was fertile, productive, and defensible. In 237 BC, Hamilcar marched his army across North Africa and through the Pillars of Hercules into the Iberian Peninsula. He took with him his son-in-law Hasdrubal. He took his general staff and his most experienced veterans. And he took his 3 young sons, Hannibal, Hasdrubal, and Mago. Hannibal was 9 years old. The story that has come down to us, and there is no reason to doubt its essential truth, is that before the expedition departed, young Hannibal begged his father to take him along. Hamilcar looked at his son for a long moment and then asked him directly, "Do you truly understand what you are asking for?" "Yes," said Hannibal. "I want to go to war." Hamilcar is said to have placed his hand on his son's head and told him, "If you want to come, you must swear an oath. Swear that you will never be a friend to Rome." Hannibal swore. He would keep that oath for the rest of his life. Hamilcar spent 9 years in Spain building something that was, in practical terms, a private empire. The silver mines were reorganized and massively expanded. New cities were founded. Alliances were struck with dozens of indigenous tribal leaders. An army was trained, not the mercenary rabble that had been Carthage's weakness in Sicily, but a disciplined, diverse, brilliantly led force that combined the heavy infantry discipline of North African Libyan troops with the ferocious cavalry of the Numidian kingdoms and the savage cutting power of the Iberian and Celtiberian warriors. When Hamilcar died in battle in the early 220s, the Spanish command passed first to his son-in-law Hasdrubal and then, when Hasdrubal was assassinated, to Hannibal himself, now 26 years old and already marked by every officer who had served with him as something extraordinary. Livy, who despised Hannibal and made no secret of it, still could not help writing one of the most compelling character portraits in all of ancient literature when he came to describe the young Carthaginian commander. "Power to command and readiness to obey are rare associates," he wrote, but in Hannibal they were perfectly united. Reckless in courting danger, he showed superb tactical ability once it was upon him. Indefatigable both physically and mentally, he could endure with equal ease excessive heat or cold. He ate and drank not to flatter his appetites, but only so much as would sustain his bodily strength. In 218 BC, after provoking Rome beyond the point of no return by attacking the Spanish city of Saguntum, a Roman ally, Hannibal made the decision that would make him immortal. He would not wait for Rome to come to him. He would go to Rome. Not by sea. The Romans controlled the sea lanes and would destroy any fleet he assembled. By land. Overland. Through southern France, through the territories of tribes who had no particular reason to welcome a Carthaginian army marching through their fields and villages, and then, impossibly, unthinkably, across the Alps. With elephants. He left Spain with approximately 50,000 infantry and 9,000 cavalry. By the time he crossed the Pyrenees, the number had shrunk to 38,000 and 8,000. By the time he reached the Rhone, it had shrunk further. And by the time he came down from the Alps into the plains of northern Italy, he had 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry left. He had lost more than half his army to the cold, the terrain, the hostile tribes of the Alpine passes, and simple desertion. He had also, in the process, become a legend. The Alpine crossing was not just a military maneuver. It was a statement. It was Hannibal announcing to the entire Mediterranean world, to Rome, to Carthage, to the Greek cities of the south, to the Celtic tribes of the north, that he was not a man who accepted the boundaries that other people drew around him. The Romans, when the news reached them, were not frightened. Not yet. They should have been. What followed was one of the most devastating military campaigns in the history of warfare. At the river Trebia, Hannibal lured a Roman army into a dawn crossing of a freezing river before they had eaten breakfast, waited until they were cold, wet, and exhausted, and then destroyed them. At Lake Trasimene, he concealed his entire army in morning mist along the shores of a lake, and ambushed a Roman force of 15,000 men so completely that the battle was over before most of the Romans understood that they were in one. And then came Cannae. The Battle of Cannae on August 2, 216 BC remains, more than 2,000 years later, the most studied single day of warfare in human history. Military academies still teach it. Generals still reference it. The word itself, Cannae, has become shorthand in military terminology for the perfect battle of encirclement, the ultimate expression of tactical genius overwhelming numerical superiority. On that morning, Hannibal faced a Roman army of approximately 87,000 men with a force barely half that size. The Roman commanders, one aggressive, one cautious, alternating command on alternate days with a dysfunction that Hannibal had already identified and planned to exploit, drew their massive infantry force up in a deep, dense formation designed to punch through whatever stood in front of it. Hannibal let them. He placed his weakest troops, Spanish and Celtic infantry, at the center of his line, curving them forward in a shallow bulge toward the Romans. On the flanks he positioned his devastating cavalry. Then he waited. The Roman infantry hit the center and drove it back. Exactly as Hannibal intended. As the Celts and Spaniards retreated, the Roman formation pushed forward, packing itself tighter and tighter into the narrowing gap. What had started as a broad battle line was compressing itself into a heaving mass of men who were rapidly losing the space to swing their swords. Then the flanks closed. Hannibal's cavalry swept around both ends of the Roman formation and crashed into the rear. The Libyan heavy infantry on his wings, held in reserve until the Roman center had pushed deep enough into the trap, pivoted inward and sealed the encirclement completely. 87,000 Roman soldiers found themselves packed into a space so tight that men were dying not from sword wounds but from suffocation, crushed to death by the weight of their own comrades pressing in from behind. By evening, approximately 70,000 Romans were dead. It remains, to this day, one of the highest single-day death tolls in the history of warfare. In Rome, a praetor climbed onto the speaker's platform in the Forum and delivered what must be the shortest and most devastating official announcement in Roman history. Pugna magna victi summus. We have been defeated in a great battle. And yet Rome did not fall. This is the part of the story that Hannibal never fully understood, even at the moment of his greatest triumph. He had shattered Roman armies 3 times in 2 years. He had killed more Roman soldiers than most wars managed to kill in a decade. He had marched through the length of Italy burning and plundering. He had stood at the gates of Rome itself with his cavalry. And Rome refused to negotiate. Not because the Romans were not frightened, they were terrified. Not because they had unlimited resources, they were nearly bankrupt. But because buried somewhere in the Roman national character was a refusal, absolute and apparently irrational, to accept that defeat meant the end. Every time Rome lost an army, it raised another. Every time a city defected to Hannibal, the Romans besieged it. Every time a consul was killed on the battlefield, the Senate met the next morning and elected a replacement. Hannibal had been taught by his Greek tutors the conventions of Hellenistic warfare: win the decisive battle, offer generous terms, reach a negotiated settlement in which the loser accepts a new political reality. He had followed that playbook to perfection. He had won the decisive battles. He had offered generous terms to Rome's Italian allies, releasing them without ransom. He had sent Roman prisoners to the Senate to negotiate ransom terms as the traditional opening move toward peace. The Senate refused to see them. Hannibal had won every battle. He was losing the war. The turning point came not in Italy but in Spain. A young Roman commander named Publius Cornelius Scipio, son and nephew of the 2 Roman generals Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal had defeated and killed in Spain, arrived on the Iberian Peninsula in 210 BC with a burning personal grievance, extraordinary military gifts, and an ability to learn from Hannibal that no previous Roman commander had possessed. Scipio studied Hannibal the way a student studies a great teacher. He absorbed the lessons of Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae. He understood that the key to Hannibal's genius was not any single tactic but a fundamental flexibility, the willingness to use whatever the situation demanded rather than what tradition prescribed. And then he used those lessons against Carthage. In 209 BC he captured New Carthage, the Barcid capital of Spain, in a single brilliant assault that stripped Carthage of its richest silver mines and its most important strategic base on the peninsula. In 208 he defeated Hasdrubal Barca at Becula. And in 206, at the Battle of Ilipa, he crushed the remaining Carthaginian forces in Spain so thoroughly that Carthage's hold on the peninsula simply dissolved. Spain was gone. Hannibal, still in Italy but now completely cut off from reinforcements and resupply, was ordered by the Carthaginian council to return home. According to Livy, he received the news with barely contained fury, grinding his teeth, almost weeping, declaring that it was not Rome that had defeated him but the Carthaginian Senate, through jealousy and obstruction and the deliberate withholding of the troops and resources he had needed. He was not entirely wrong. But he came home. The final act played out on North African soil at the Battle of Zama in 202 BC. Scipio, now commanding a veteran force reinforced by the magnificent Numidian cavalry of his ally King Massinissa, faced Hannibal across an open plain. Hannibal deployed his troops in 3 lines with his best veterans held in reserve. He had 80 elephants in the front rank and the confidence of a man who had never lost a major battle in his life. This time he lost. Scipio had prepared his troops specifically for the elephant charge, opening lanes in his formation that channeled the animals harmlessly through the Roman lines. When Massinissa's cavalry swept away the Carthaginian horsemen and crashed into the rear of Hannibal's infantry, it was Cannae in reverse. Carthage surrendered. The terms were brutal. 10,000 talents of silver. 10 warships. No wars outside Africa without Roman permission. No wars inside Africa without Roman permission. Carthage was finished as a military power. But Rome was not finished with Carthage. 50 years later, as Carthage quietly recovered, rebuilding its trade networks, expanding its agricultural production, paying off its war indemnity ahead of schedule, the Roman senator Marcus Porcius Cato stood up in the Senate and ended every speech he gave with the same 5 words. Carthage must be destroyed. Not because Carthage threatened Rome. By 149 BC, Carthage had no fleet, no significant army, and no allies capable of challenging Roman power. But it was prosperous. It was visibly, irritatingly prosperous. And prosperity, in the eyes of men like Cato, was itself a kind of threat. Rome manufactured the pretext it needed. When Carthage dared to defend its own territory against repeated Numidian encroachments that Rome had consistently ruled in favor of despite their obvious injustice, Rome declared that Carthage had violated its treaty by making war without permission. The Carthaginians, desperate to avoid destruction, surrendered their weapons. All of them. 20,000 suits of armor. 2,000 catapults. Everything. Then Rome told them to destroy their city. The Carthaginians had been disarmed. They had surrendered their children as hostages. They had given up everything that could be given up. Now they were told to give up their home. And that, finally, after decades of humiliation and compliance, was something they refused to do. They rebuilt their weapons from nothing, working day and night in shifts, women cutting their hair to use as catapult strings. They fought for 3 years against the most powerful military machine in the ancient world with the desperation of people who understood, with absolute clarity, that there was nothing left to lose. It was not enough. In 146 BC the walls came down, the fires went up, and a civilization that had existed for nearly 7 centuries was reduced to ash. The survivors, men, women, children, the old, the sick, were sold into slavery. The buildings were demolished. A curse was placed on anyone who tried to rebuild on the site. And the libraries, the histories, the records of 700 years of Carthaginian life, were distributed to local kings or simply burned. Rome did not just destroy a city that day. It destroyed a version of history. It destroyed the evidence. It silenced the only voice that could have told the story differently. If you have stayed with this story until now, and I hope you have, because it is one of the most extraordinary stories the ancient world has to offer, then you already understand something that most people who have never heard of Carthage do not. That the version of history we inherit is always the version written by whoever was left standing at the end. Carthage did not sacrifice its children because it was barbaric. It did not lose to Rome because it was inferior. It did not disappear from history because it deserved to disappear. It disappeared because Rome was willing to do something that even Rome's greatest admirers found difficult to justify, and then spent the next 5 centuries making sure that everyone who heard the story heard Rome's version of it. Richard Miles, who wrote the extraordinary book on which this video is based, put it better than anyone. The destruction of Carthage, he argued, was not just a military event. It was an act of historical theft. Rome stole Carthage's past, rewrote it, and handed it back to the world as fact. We have been living with that theft ever since. Now you know the truth. If this video gave you a name, a civilization, a story that you did not have before, share it with someone who thinks they know everything about the ancient world. Subscribe to this channel, because we are just getting started. And leave a comment below telling us which part of Carthage's story hit you hardest. Was it Alyssa cutting the ox hide into strips and outsmarting a king? Was it Hannibal standing on the south bank of the Alps, looking down at Italy with half the army he started with, and deciding to keep going anyway? Or was it those final days in 146 BC, when a city with no weapons and no allies and no hope decided that some things were worth dying for? Tell us below. The story of Carthage deserves to be remembered.